Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Lori Hearn. I'm the CEO, the founder, and the editor of inewsource. And I'm excited to have all of you gather for our 15th anniversary. I want to thank the Loma Santa Fe Country Club for welcoming us, and especially our longtime supporters, the San Diego Foundation, for helping to support this event. I have the pleasure today to thank all of you for investing in our nonprofit news organization. This past year, we've delivered some of San Diego's most impactful reporting with your support. We told more than 150 stories that might not have been discovered if not for us. We told groundbreaking award-winning coverage that you can't read anywhere else, but you can see highlighted in our 2024 annual report, which happy to have you take a copy of on your way out. I would like to have our news team and our documenters team please stand. We'll hear more about them in a few minutes. Their hard work and their reporting is the reason we're here. These stories can also not be told without the rest of our inewsource team, from audience engagement to philanthropy, operations, and editorial cartooning. We're reinventing the way we tell stories and keep the organization running effectively. Can the rest of the team stand as well? Thank you. Before I introduce our discussion leaders today, I have some comments to make about our 15 years in business. People always say, I can't believe it's been 5 years, or 10 years, or 15 years since they started an organization, but truly I can't believe it. The other thing people say is the only constant in life is change. Just when we start getting adjusted to the next new thing, there is another new thing. When I started inewsource 15 years ago, the imperative was simple and clear. It was the Great Recession. Everything, including traditional media, especially newspapers, were crashing and crumbling. I looked out across the country and saw the most experienced, most expensive journalists become the most expendable. The imperative for a new newsroom was to make sure that deep public service journalism and scrutiny of the public officials was not lost here in San Diego. Over this decade and a half, thanks to the support of all of you, inewsource has been known for its investigative and accountability reporting that has changed laws and improved lives. From shining a light on impossible choices at the end of life to exposing illegal rent increases on the county's poorest tenants, we're proud of how we have served the community with tangible and positive impacts. This kind of reporting is journalism's gold standard. That means watchdogging local government and the officials who run it and revealing injustices that threaten local democracy. Fast forward to today. The imperative is just as clear and just as compelling, but much has changed. Distrust of the media, the news, is escalating. The number of trained journalists continues to go down. California has lost 1/3 of its newspapers, 1/3 since 2005. It's less than 20 years. The number of journalists in the state has dropped 68% since then. And despite shifting efforts to digital, news outlets are struggling to attract readers and subscribers. Here in San Diego, the staff of the Union Tribune, actually my alma mater, I've worked there for many years, whose motto once was, "The Ring of Truth," is now at little more than 60 staff members. When I left, the newsroom was closer to 400. You don't know what you don't know. Misinformation is also seeps into the void where an agreed-upon set of facts used to be. Finally, polarization stands stubbornly in the way of civil discourse. Who can we trust? We can't even reasonably be sure that our neighbors are going to stop at the stop signs in our neighborhood anymore, right? 15 years ago, I didn't think the obstacles we faced in the media could get worse, but I was wrong. That doesn't mean, however, that there's nothing we can do about it. We have to circle back and start rebuilding the trust that communities used to have in each other. And the media needs to start building trust with communities they have long ignored or misrepresented. As we move into the next 15 years, inewsource is reinventing itself. No, we're not abandoning our mission to be society's protectors, to watchdog the powerful. We are actually leaning into our mandate to do investigative journalism. We're doubling down on that imperative. What is changing is how we plan to do that. First, we need to build trust. That starts at the ground level. One meeting, one conversation, one room at a time. We need to listen. We need to stop talking and lecturing so much. When we do talk, it needs to be with empathy and with an authentic attempt to understand, and with the expertise and authority we have worked hard to master. We're relying on the community to inform and inspire our investigative work. That's why we brought the documenters to San Diego. For those of you who are not familiar with that program, it's less than a year old. But it's a program that recruits and pays community members, students to senior citizens, to attend public meetings and report on them. I can tell you about, you can get a little bit of the scope of the problem about public meetings when you think that in San Diego County, which is a population of 3.3 million people, 18 cities, 42 school districts, 30-some water districts, there are 650 government agencies. They all meet, they all spend money, they all make policies. And they spend $16 billion a year. Who is watching them? That's where the documenters come in, and that's where our investigative reporters come in. So if you want to know more about the documenters program, I'm going to point out Josh back there and Isaac. They are the founders of our documenters program here in San Diego, and they're happy to tell you more. All our recent research in this area and in the media tells us that people want local news that is relevant to the lives they live. They want information that is useful and information that is illuminating. They want it where they are and on their terms. If that means a 5,000-word, deep dive, data-driven narrative with graphics, inewsource has it. If you want a graphic novel, thanks to Steve Green, we got you there too. And if you want a story on Instagram told by a reporter jumping out of a recycling bin, we got you there too. Local research also tells us that people want to know that we trained journalists are out there looking out for them. They want the facts, but they don't want sensationalism. So as we mark 15 years of doing hard and important work, let's celebrate the investigative journalism. Let's celebrate the standards we embrace that are meant to convince you that you can trust us. Some years ago, we published a particularly controversial story that revealed serious problems in a much beloved local institution. I remember asking one of our supporters what he thought of that story. He said he was surprised to read about the conclusions and sad to read about the allegations. But he said, if inewsource reported it, it must be true. That is the highest praise. I'm proud of the credibility we have built over the past 15 years, and I promise we will continue building on it for the next 15. Thank you. Okay, with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our guests today, Justine Elliot from ProPublica, and Jamie Self, who is our managing editor. First of all, Justine Elliot has been a reporter with ProPublica, where he covers business and politics since 2012. In 2023, he and his colleagues revealed how a set of politically connected billionaires provided lavish gifts and travel to Supreme Court justices over many years. Those stories were honored with the Pulitzer Prize Gold Medal for Public Service. team of reporters documenting how the rich avoid taxes for the Secret IRS File series. He co-wrote a story revealing how tech mogul Peter Thiel turned a Roth IRA into a multi-billion-dollar tax haven. His work has spurred congressional investigations and changes to federal law. His coverage of the TurboTax maker Intuit's misleading marketing tactics led to a settlement delivering $141 million back to consumers. Before ProPublica, Justine reported for a number of publications, including Salon, where he was a staff writer focusing on domestic and foreign lobbying, campaign finance, and politics. He earned a bachelor's degree from Brown University in history and the classics. He served as executive editor of the Brown Daily Herald during his time there. Thank you, Justine, for joining us today.
Thanks so much.
Let me give you a little bit more of an introduction of our own Jamie Self, who is our managing editor. Jamie manages the newsroom, and she drives our editorial strategy. In 2021, she joined us from her home state in South Carolina. Yes, we lured her away from her home state, where she led the politics and state government team at the state newspaper in Columbia. In that role, Jamie led an investigation revealing that state lawmakers were secretly funneling millions in taxpayer dollars to pet projects in their districts. The reporting inspired a new law that brought more accountability and transparency to the state budget process. Before that, she was an investigative and political reporter, covering first in the South presidential primaries and state elections, and producing award-winning enterprise and investigative reporting on many state issues, including public corruption, child welfare, education, abortion, and more. She also covered the massacre of the African-American churchgoers at Mother Emanuel AME in Charleston, and the subsequent battle to remove the Confederate flag from the State House grounds. Jamie has a master's in literature and taught college writing and research before turning to journalism. Thank you, Jamie, for joining us. I'm thrilled to talk with you today about my two favorite subjects. I might be a nerd, but it's investigative journalism and nonprofit news. Many of you probably know ProPublica is a nonprofit journalism organization as well as inewsource. So I've been looking forward to this conversation because it spans such a big, glorious space, and that is national investigative journalism and local investigative journalism, and why those two things are important. But first, we've all been in this space for a while, the three of us. Okay, I've been in it for a really long time. And we all have stories. I could talk about my days as a reporter being accused publicly by a judge of receiving stolen property. Not true. And when I convinced my paper to send me halfway around the world to cover a judicial candidate in Australia, who decided not to talk to me 24 hours after I arrived. That was a fun conversation to have with your editor at midnight. Then, as an editor, having to face the fact that the subject of one of our investigations pulled $3 million in advertising from the newspaper because of our work. I wasn't shown the door. I was actually praised for it. So enough about me. I'd like to jump in and have our two guests talk about themselves a little bit. Justine, you were majoring in the classics at Brown. How did you go from reading poetry in Latin to reading IRS codes?
Yeah, can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, I wish I could say it was a well-crafted plan, but the truth is, you know, my freshman year of college, I had a girlfriend whose older sister was the editor of the student newspaper, and we were hanging out, and totally by chance, the older sister asked me, needed something done, needed a story covered for the paper, and you know, I had to say yes. It was my girlfriend's older sister, so I did it. Not long after that, the relationship ended, but you know, I felt the intoxication of seeing my name in print and the kind of the license to pick up the phone and just start asking people questions, essentially like a license to be nosy, and that stuck with me even though the relationship ended. That's where it all started.
Jamie, you had a similar trajectory. Also classics in college.
Thank you. I was teaching at Boston University while my now husband was finishing an MFA in painting. And we had friends also from South Carolina, also like us, feeling very much fish out of water in these elite schools and areas. And our friends were at New Haven finishing an MFA in painting at Yale, which is a very prestigious degree. And we were wrapping that up and thinking, what are we doing? This is not our final destination. And we all wanted to do some traveling. We had not seen many parts of the United States. And so I'm going to try to make this really quick, okay? But we started thinking, how can we do that? How can we see more of the country? And maybe we should form kind of an art collective, and maybe we should live on a bus. Yes, let's live on a bus. And so we found these online communities that convert city transit buses into RVs and also convert them to run off of waste vegetable oil, which was plentiful across the country at the time. And so that's what we did. We bought a bus, we converted it, and we set out to explore. And little did I know that I became a journalist at that moment, right? Because I interviewed people, I wrote essays, I published them to a website that we formed. My husband, who's a documentary filmmaker now, we bought a nice camera and he started making small documentary films about the places and the people we visited. And so when we did that for 2 years, I experienced so much of the country and so many communities and befriended so many people, and it was a real education in journalism. And then we got tired of our friends, as you might expect, and they're still our best friends, but we decided to come home. And then I was like, okay, what am I going to do now? I did not want a PhD, so I decided to start working for the local newspaper, and I have never looked back. I mean, I've never said yes to a career more than this, and it's just been, the rest has been history.
Thank you so much. Jamie and her husband clearly are adventurers. We uprooted them from South Carolina, where her children's grandparents are, and they came out here to help us shape inewsource for the next 15 years. So Justin, let's circle back to the story probably many people in this room are wanting to hear about, and that is your investigation with your colleagues of the U.S. Supreme Court. So I'd like you to kind of start out with, like, how did that story even get started?
Yeah, you know, sometimes stories start from tips, but this, which is kind of the easiest way it happens, if it's a good tip. But in this case, it wasn't that. Another reporter, ProPublica, and I, Josh Kaplan, were in the part of the sort of journalistic cycle that I know many people here are familiar with, which is you're staring at a blank screen and you have no ideas and no sources, and you're like, what am I going to do next? And we had decided to poke around on the topic of the courts. The federal courts seemed undercovered. And so we were kind of calling around, doing some reading about the courts. We were not planning on covering the Supreme Court because it actually seems like, at the time, it seemed like the part of the federal judiciary that actually has the most coverage. There's, you know, the major newspapers all have Supreme Court reporters. And so the way this shaped up originally was we were on the phone with somebody and they were reminding us about the circumstances of the death of Justice Scalia, who you may remember died in 2016 in his sleep unexpectedly. And when he died, he was not in Washington, D.C. He was actually on like a private hunting ranch in Texas. And it came out after he died that the ranch was owned by a wealthy businessman who had actually had some business before the Supreme Court, which raised some eyebrows. And that got us, and you know, this was a couple years ago, so that was, the Scalia thing, it was 8 years previous, but it got us thinking about the basic question of who has access to Supreme Court justices when they're not at the court hearing oral arguments. And so, you know, we did the thing that investigative reporters do, which is the first thing that you look for, one of the first things you look for is, what kind of public records can you get about this topic? Like, can we file a FOIA request or somehow get public records that would shed light on this? And we quickly learned that we really couldn't, because the federal public records law, FOIA, turns out it carved out the courts, and it doesn't apply to the court system, so you can't get public records from the Supreme Court. So the early breakthrough was when we realized that when the justices travel outside of Washington, D.C., they get security from the U.S. Marshals Service. And by kind of a quirk of the bureaucracy, the marshals are not actually housed within the court system, they're housed within the Justice Department, which is part of the executive branch, where public records laws do apply. And so we got a stack of essentially like budget requests from the marshals when a Supreme Court justice travels, requests security, the marshals send some agents with them, and need some money for that. And these documents were highly redacted. They would tell you, some justice, name redacted, traveled from San Diego to New York on X date. Just switch this. And so we're going through these documents, and to cut to the chase, we start to see references to private jets, which caught our attention because it seems like kind of a rarefied way to travel. And by the way, there was other references in there to justices traveling, on Delta or on Amtrak, normal ways to travel. So we start to pull out all these references to private jets, and my colleague, who's a researcher at ProPublica, was looking at one of these trips, which is a private jet trip from Washington, D.C. to New Haven and back. And he actually found a Facebook page of plane enthusiasts based at the New Haven, Connecticut airport, who had, and he found a post, he's a brilliant researcher, found a Facebook post from several years ago on the same day as the Marshals record we were looking at, with the video of a plane taking off, and the little note on the Facebook post said something like, "We were honored today to get a visit from Justice Clarence Thomas at the New Haven airport." And so we were like, okay, that's kind of, this one's Clarence Thomas. And then we were able to get flight records and identify who owned the private jet, and it turned out it was this Dallas billionaire political donor that we hadn't heard of named Harlan Crow. And that got us thinking, we called some air charter companies, and they told us, this flight from Washington, D.C. to New Haven and back in the same day, like, this could cost you $70,000, $80,000, so a significant amount of money. And so that got us thinking that maybe there was something more here. And so we started, I'll wrap this up briefly, but we started to dig into this relationship between Crow and Thomas. And the other kind of big conceptual breakthrough was when we realized that we had gotten sort of lucky in our choice of subject, Harlan Crow, because he was a guy he's a guy who's very much not reclusive. He owns a super yacht that employs a staff of 30 people. He has properties around the country that have, that are resorts that also have staffs of 20 or 30 people. He owns this private jet that has pilots and flight attendants. So he has many employees around him. And so instead of trying to penetrate the Supreme Court, which is very difficult, maybe impossible to do, to get people to the Supreme Court to talk to you, where there's this culture of secrecy and discretion, we decided that we were going to try to penetrate the world of Harlan Crow, in particular by talking to these service workers. And so we started making, dozens and dozens, ultimately probably hundreds of phone calls to service workers, people that had worked on the yacht, on the plane. And these people, some of whom were really taking a risk by talking to us. They were not supposed to be talking to us. Turned out Clarence Thomas had been going on, incredibly luxurious vacations by, being flown by private jet around the world, taking these cruises on the yacht, Indonesia, New Zealand, vacations that would cost many hundreds of thousands of dollars. And we pieced together that first story largely by talking to these people that had worked, in the kind of unsexy service jobs in these settings. So that's how it started.
So given how much it took to do that story, to unearth that beginnings of that story, people could say, oh, well, you were just after the conservative members of the court. I mean, the other stories that came out were about Alito. How much did you dig into all the Supreme Court?
That's a good question. So yeah, we have definitely been accused of being partisan hacks by many people, but the way this started, again, was not, we're going to report on Thomas. The way it started was with the stack of U.S. Marshals travel records, where we literally didn't know the justices whose travel was being described because it was redacted. And so we actually looked at all the justices, and we simply, after the first story was published about this, 20 plus years of lavish vacations provided by Crow, we got a huge number of tips. The story ended up getting a lot of attention. A lot of people read it. I always have my email address and phone number on the bottom of the story. And Josh Kaplan, the other reporter, and I started to get our phones were ringing off the hook. And very quickly we found out that, and confirmed and published stories about Harlan Crow doing undisclosed real estate deals with Clarence Thomas. He paid the private school tuition of Clarence Thomas's essentially adopted son, was essentially subsidizing his life in ways that went way, way beyond any kind of normal friendship. But to answer your question, at this point anyways, we just haven't found anything equivalent with the other justices. We did write one story about Alito that I could talk more about. And I always say I would love nothing more than to find out that Elena Kagan has been taking suitcases full of money from George Soros, because we would, if anyone knows anything about something like that, please let us know, because we would love to stop being accused of being partisan hacks. But again, we were just looking at we followed where the facts led us, basically.
Just one last question. So, can you take us inside the newsroom on these big stories? I worked in many newsrooms for a long time. They tend to be really competitive places, even internally. So tell us what the challenges were, and maybe some dirty laundry that went on in ProPublica. Were any of your colleagues really jealous of your doing these stories? Did they want on? Were they trying to get the story away from you? This isn't just stuff that movies are made of.
I mean, honestly, one of the things about working at ProPublica that is a luxury is, unlike working at an investigative team at a newspaper, where the kind of classic scenario is you, the person on the investigative team, start pursuing some Supreme Court story, and suddenly you have to contend with the fact that your newspaper employs a Supreme Court reporter, beat reporter, whose job is covering that X, Y, or Z institution, whose job probably in part depends on maintaining some sort of good relationship or access. And fortunately, we honestly don't have that, because we only do investigative stuff. And so there was no one. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but there was no internal competition. I think the diciest situations really were external, and the most kind of intense story was actually not about Justice Thomas, it was about Justice Alito. And, to give you the very brief summary, if you want to read the 6,000 word story, you can find it. But the brief summary was that Justice Alito was brought on this incredibly lavish Alaska fishing vacation by a couple of extremely wealthy businessmen and political donors, again picked up by private jet, ferried to Alaska, several days of fishing at this incredibly luxurious lodge, a vacation that would cost probably hundreds of thousands of dollars if you actually paid for it. And the twist on this case was that the billionaire that transported Alito there and was on the vacation with him was a hedge fund guy named Paul Singer, based in New York. And his hedge fund actually had cases at the Supreme Court before and after the trip. Without going into all the detail, it was a very long-running litigation pitting this hedge fund against actually the nation of Argentina. It was like a sovereign debt dispute. And so we had uncovered details of this trip, and we were talking to experts about should Justice Alito have recused himself given that he'd taken gifts from one of the litigants, and the answer was basically yes, although there's no real way to enforce that. And so we did what we always do, and I'm sure what you all do, at inewsource like all the time, which is we went to Alito with, we call it No Surprises, where we basically lay out everything we're thinking about reporting in a story, essentially in the form of a question, and ask either for an interview or for some sort of written response. And so we sent this long list of questions. I got on the phone with the Supreme Court press officer, and she told us, Justice Alito is not going to be commenting. And so we were like, okay, it's his right. We're going to publish a story on, that was maybe a Monday, we're going to publish a story on Thursday. Then I'm like eating dinner that night, and suddenly my phone starts like beeping and buzzing. And Justice Alito had published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal before our story was published with the headline, "ProPublica misleads its readers." Responding to these questions, again, we hadn't actually published a story, so no one really knew what he was talking about. But we were being accused of misleading our readers by like a sitting Supreme Court justice in the Wall Street Journal before our story had even been published. And so, and he was also arguing about the technicalities of the disclosure law, where justices are supposed to be disclosing gifts. And so, I would say that was a tense moment where we had to then try to publish a story, which we ultimately did publish that night around 11 p.m. But before that, it was calling up lawyers, asking them about, here's what Justice Alito is saying about how the disclosure law works. And I think he actually cited Black's Law Dictionary in that, in some 16th century definition of the word facility or something. And so we were, basically getting into an argument about the law with the Supreme Court justice, and then trying to incorporate that in our story and get it out so people could understand what it was about. So I think that was the highest tension moment.
Gnarly. So, Jamie, we certainly at inewsource are proud of the impact we have, but we know there's no such thing as an easy investigative story. You get a call from somebody who gives you what sounds like a really juicy tip, and you think, well, this is pretty straightforward. I know how to report it, and we'll just have the story in 2 days. Not so much. Things very quickly get gray and murky. So tell the folks about one of the more challenging stories at inewsource and how maybe that scenario played out.
Sure, thank you. So I have a great example because we've been working on this story for a couple years now and actually wrapped up this investigation in 2022. There's been ongoing reporting following up. Many of you may be familiar with the Veterans Village coverage that we did. And we recently published a story that said Veterans Village, which once was a renowned treatment center for veterans and other folks too, and we reported recently that they had their license revoked by the state, and then the most recent story was that they were not going to appeal the decision. So effectively what this means is that they are out of the business of treating drug abuse and substance abuse. And so this has been a difficult story to report from the beginning because the organization itself, again, great reputation, did not want to cooperate with us in our investigative reporting. And Jill Castellano started that reporting, and she talked to more than 40 people who had been residents and been treated at the facility. Some of them were current, some of them were former. Many of them said that the organization changed their lives. And that reporting, the sourcing that she had there was absolutely critical. Because if you look at the public record that's created whenever the state comes in and regulates, it doesn't always provide the detail about the moldy food or the incidents that happen at the location where all of the people who've died there, in fact. And those are all things that our reports revealed and made public. And so I know Jennifer Bowman and I were having a conversation a few months ago about the outcome of that investigation and how it takes time for these things to unfold. But sure enough, there was another death at Veterans Village. Greg Moran wrote about it and made calls to the organization. Still very little willingness to cooperate. So it is often doing the work, bulletproofing it as much as you possibly can, and then sending the email or the follow-up, and often getting no comment. You need to have a great First Amendment and attorney on your hands to do legal reviews. Shout out to Matthew in the back there. And, it's hard work. Matthew, you just got an applause.
It wasn't just failing to cooperate, right?
Right, yes, it was accusing us of many inaccuracies to start. That was actually the best part of what we were accused of. Later on, more recently, we were actually accused in their statement that they did not provide to us, but of course we acquired, that we were actually, on some mission to ruin the reputation of this organization. No idea why we would ever be out to get them, but that was a public accusation that other media outlets in San Diego printed. I got a call from KPBS asking me if I'd like to respond, and I did. And I said, you know what, we've given them many opportunities before, during, and after publication to respond to our reporting, which is rigorously fact-checked. We stand by our reporting. And that was that. So, when you're doing this work, you get, I don't think I can top the Supreme Court justice coming after you. That does sound very nerve-wracking, but all the time, investigative reporters deal with this kind of pushback and hostility from subjects who absolutely do not want you to publish what you're working on.
So take it another level, and let's say these kinds of threats come to the organization, they come to the reporting, to the story, but they're also personal attacks. And we know across the country that reporters have been personally, physically attacked, and then also through social media and that sort of thing. So can each of you talk a little bit about whether you've been subjected to personal attacks, whether physical or through social media? I think, Josh, you were talking about somebody.
Yeah, it was, a sort of strange part of this job is sometimes I fly somewhere just for the purpose of, just to knock on 5 or 10 people's doors. Sometimes we show up at people's houses if they're potentially important sources, and, we either can't reach them by phone, or if it's something sensitive and we want to talk about it in person, which is, I think a little bit jarring for some people to have a reporter show up unannounced in your door, but it is sometimes an effective reporting tactic. I was recently on one of these trips in Florida, and for the first time after doing this for many years, somebody threatened to shoot me if I didn't get off his property, and I'm sure he actually did have guns. And I think this was maybe I just caught this guy in a bad mood, but I sort of interpreted, I sort of took this a little bit as a sign of the times, because this was a part of Florida that was very, very sort of near Mar-a-Lago, a lot of heavy pro-Trump sentiment. Not that anti-media sentiment is limited to one party by any means, but it does feel like something shifted. When, especially with Trump and some people around Trump, they're now saying explicitly that they want to jail journalists if there's a second Trump administration. And of course, it's always, is this bluster? Is it joking? Hard to tell. But it does feel like there's a kind of dark mood in the country.
I'll say personally, back when I was a State House reporter, Nikki Haley yelled at me during a press conference once because I was calling her out on something she was not telling the truth about. So that was fun. It was kind of funny because it was also hard to hear, but she was definitely yelling at me. And I also was written about, I was actually sharing this with a reporter recently, just horror stories, like don't feel so bad if people are jerks. That's kind of what you encounter sometimes on this job. But I wrote some stories that some lawmakers didn't like about conflicts of interest, and They planted a story in a local blog, and so I had to read about myself and what a horrible reporter I was in the blog. And so, you know, you do get attacked in that way, and, you know, I think over the years you learn to just get over it, and you realize that nobody's paying that close of attention. But I'll also say that I agree with Justin that I feel like there was, when I was a reporter, I felt like even though that kind of thing happened occasionally, there was still this recognition that we all are playing our roles and our parts. And so it didn't carry over into other things, that negativity or that animosity. But now things are a bit different. And at inewsource, we've done some reporting on white supremacists in San Diego. And that reporting has brought our team very close to dangers that we had not had to complicate or contemplate prior. And essentially because these people don't play by the rules, right? So we had a reporter who was illegally recorded during a private conversation by someone who was pretending to be someone else that she was calling for a story. As part of that reporting on this white supremacist in San Diego, she also got on the radar of some of these social media personalities who were taking upon themselves to expose white supremacists. And as a part of that, she was talked about, right, and identified. And I think that gets very scary because then you start to wonder how much do they know about me? Do they know where I live? Because doxing is a very real tool that they use to harass people and to have a chilling effect on the media and others who might be getting in their way. And so fortunately it didn't go that far, and we immediately came together and made an inewsource-wide policy that we will have access to programs that scrape our personal identifying information from the internet on a routine basis. But we also cover immigration, and that poses all sorts of risks and threats that you don't experience just covering regular government. And so it's an ongoing conversation for us. What are the risks? Can we weigh the benefit of doing this reporting against the risk? And we're also doing risk assessments whenever we have reporting that we think could be dicey. And you know, that has to do with white supremacists or environmental exposure. So, yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, on a maybe slightly more uplifting note, compared for both of what we're saying, I did have an experience doing the Supreme Court reporting that was, it was sort of uplifting, which was we were, a lot of the sources we were trying to talk to, like on the Alito thing, for example, were people, I mean, again, this was, some service workers, people in the legal world, but these were people who were very much across the spectrum in terms of their political beliefs. Some people probably hated Alito's decisions, and some people totally supported them. And these were mostly ordinary people that just don't deal with reporters a lot. And one of the pitches that we were making to people was, look, if you found yourself in some kind of court case, a lawsuit, litigation, wouldn't you want to know if the person on the other side of that case had been paying for the judge's vacations? And honestly, I mean, and that's what the story was about. And there was plenty of Republicans, conservatives that talked to us and helped us on these stories because even if they'd never talked to a reporter before and probably had some sort of broad hostility to the media, once we presented ourselves and could hopefully they could tell that we were operating in good faith and we were following the facts where they led, and like a lot of people were convinciable, and so it's not everyone is threatening to shoot you, and so I think that does give me a little bit of hope, but maybe we just need to change people like one reporting call at a time.
Thanks. So I'm going to ask one more question, then we'll open it up for questions. There's a lot of pressure, I think, on investigative journalists to have impact with their stories. I mean, I was a reporter for a long time, and you write a big story, and then there's crickets when it's published. You don't hear anything from anybody, nothing really happens. I kind of came away finally in my career to think that my biggest and highest outcome can be getting people to think about what it was that I wrote. Even if nothing happens, like a law doesn't change, or somebody's life isn't inalterably changed, that's a good thing. Still, there's a lot of pressure for tangible impact. So when you go after stories, or in Jamie's case, when you decide what stories are worth going after, you can spin your wheels a lot. You can follow a tip for a few months and it goes nowhere. So talk about the pressure and how you view your own level of need for that kind of impact.
Okay. Sure. So, yeah, I mean, definitely at ProPublica, like you, we care a lot about impact, and that's the ultimate goal. But it's also, it's so difficult to reverse engineer, and so when I'm trying to decide on what I'm going to spend my time pursuing, I mean, that's sort of in the mix is something I'm thinking about, but it's not at all determinative, because I think it's, with the Supreme Court stuff, we had no idea, you never even know if anyone's going to read your story. We had no idea that after we published a story about the travel that we're going to get all these tips, and it was going to turn out that, Justice Thomas was having his whole life paid for by political donors or parts of his life. The way I think about story selection is, I mean, to put it sort of in gambling terms, is, placing bets with your time. And what I'm looking for are stories that are either undercovered or not covered, things that are undercovered or not covered that are also important. And one of the privileges of this job also is sometimes making bets that you lose, because the nature of this reporting is you might spend 2 months on something and you even if it's true, you just can't get it, you hit a wall, or maybe you got a really plausible sounding tip and it turns out actually it's just not there, it's not a story. So that happens all the time. So the way I think about it is, just because you lost the bet doesn't mean it was a bad bet. And hopefully, to get to your question about impact, hopefully if you put something out there that has solid information and is revelatory, hopefully it gets an audience. It doesn't always get an audience, but hopefully it gets an audience. And I've found that often when things get a wide audience, impact does come in some form or another.
And what about,
may not be as satisfying.
What about the Supreme Court? Have you seen
so
impact?
The Supreme Court's an interesting case because it's a kind of unique. It's because it's the Supreme Court. There's no one above it. The Supreme Court did adopt a code of conduct after our stories were published. However, and this was significant. It's the first code of conduct the Supreme Court's ever had in its 200+ year history. However, the code of conduct that they unanimously adopted is lacking one thing, which is any enforcement mechanism. Generally how rules work in our society is you need some kind of enforcement mechanism to take it seriously. And there's been a debate playing out to some extent in public where Justice Kagan, Justice Brown Jackson have now said publicly that they are open to an enforcement mechanism being added to the code of conduct. Maybe it would be like a panel of appellate court judges who would play some sort of adjudicatory role. So that happened. The Senate opened an investigation into what we wrote about, has issued some subpoenas. That's still playing out. The judiciary has kind of like a self-governing arm that is also at least nominally supposed to be investigating Justice Thomas's violations of the gift disclosure law, and so that's still playing out. So we'll see, but I think the Supreme Court's a bit of a tough case because they have lifetime tenure. The Constitution only gives I believe gives one remedy, which is impeachment of justices. Maybe you can tell me if I'm correct about that. Constitutional scholar in the front row. And so it's a bit of a tough case.
Yeah, I I think a lot about impact when I'm talking with reporters about stories, and I do think it's important to keep it in mind at the beginning of a story to think about, okay, if we're going to invest this amount of time in this reporting, how heavy of a lift is it going to be first, right? We need to understand what we're getting into. And if this thing that we think is true turns out to be true, what could the impact be, right? We're not advocates, right? We're not rooting for certain outcomes, but I do think there's, we can think about the interest to the public of maybe forcing a public policy debate on a topic, right? So to give you an example, Cody has been working on the illegal rent increases project, and he sort of stumbled into Section 8 because it's a federal program and it would have public data that we could dig into to see just how often landlords in San Diego County are raising rents beyond the legal cap. But his interest has been more broadly looking at San Diego County, and when we broke the story about the local housing agency, which delivers $300 million in vouchers annually to low-income families, when we broke the news about them not even checking to make sure that the rent increases were complying with state law, we saw immediate impact. The next week, the city council president was grilling the housing chief in a public meeting. That does not always happen. It does not always happen that way. And what it told us is that they didn't know, right, that it was actually a secret, that this wasn't happening locally. And so Cody just chipped away at every single housing agency, emailing everyone, calling everyone, saying, hey, what are you doing? Are you also not following the law? And we ended up, getting on the record all of these housing commissions across the county. We had housing attorneys tell him that he had made calls to some housing agencies up in Northern California who these attorneys could not get to respond to them. And then after he called, suddenly they understand what their policy is and is going to be moving forward. So that's really great. So now we're at a point where we still want to do something on illegal rent increases in San Diego County, and there's no rent registry, there's still no public widespread data, so we'll have to crowdsource it. So why even bother, right? And I think the answer is, well, because there are other counties in California that have some solutions that they're offering, right? Even an administrative office where you could go as a tenant and say, I think my landlord is taking me to the bank. We don't have that, right? So we're not advocating for that, but we are thinking that it would be a good public interest to have some kind of conversation about it, which we aren't having. And we know from sourcing that it's happening all the time. And the only real recourse that a tenant has is to hire an attorney. And that's just impractical and impossible for most low-income renters in San Diego County. So we think about impact, I think, in that way. Where could this go? And also, how can our follow-up reporting lead to that direction, right? What sort of stories do we need to do to get people on the record and to put pressure on public officials to weigh in on the things that they don't want to talk about? That's a hard thing to do, especially when it's very easy just to ignore a reporter, but it's worth giving it a shot.
Thanks. Let's open it up to questions. Will, are you going to correct?
We'll have time for about 3 questions.
Mr. Elliott, if Donald Trump is reelected, do you expect you and your colleagues to be targeted? And if so, what are the resources that you have access to defend yourselves?
It's funny, I mean, it's not funny, but I've been writing about Trump's media company, this new company that names Truth Social, and I'm currently actually right now on a legal hold preserving my documents because they threatened to sue us over some of our stories.
How unusual.
Yeah. It is annoying though to have to preserve all your documents. But I don't know if I expect us specifically to be targeted, but I think that depending on what kind of stories we break in a second Trump administration, we could be targeted. I mean, again, there people who were high up officials in the first Trump administration, like the name that is coming to mind is this guy Kash Patel, who I think was at one point acting director of national intelligence, maybe at the end of the first Trump term, has said publicly that that he wants them to, jail journalists and go after journalists in a second term. Another thing that I'm worried about is the Supreme Court. Justice Thomas, this predates Trump, but at least some of the justices on the court, including Justice Thomas, have said in opinions for several years now that they want to revisit New York Times v. Sullivan, which is like a foundational press freedom case going back to the Pentagon Papers about, I'm no lawyer, but it's about like prior restraint and how much the government can try to get involved before a story comes out. So broadly speaking, I'm very worried.
Justin, some of your best stories at ProPublica, as I recall, came from a media company. You didn't know the source. It was a secret source. How did you decide what to run and whether the material you got was true and comprehensive? How did you know some of it was important to believe? And congratulations on those stories.
Thanks. Yeah, so this is a reference to a project I worked on previously, which was, the short version is that my colleagues originally were the recipients of a very large leak of IRS tax return data, essentially the tax returns of hundreds of the very wealthiest people in the country, people like Elon Musk. And I was brought in as one of the reporters to work on that material to try to see if there was interesting stories there. I mean, to answer your question about, well, there's two parts. How do we figure out it was real? Because as you said, we didn't know the source of the information, it sort of came over the transom. We did several things. We were trying to cross-check the tax data that we were looking at with anything we could find in the public domain that would have that same information. So maybe some lawsuit that listed somebody's income for, maybe there was a bankruptcy or a divorce where somebody had to file their income for a year, and so we could look up that in a public record independently and then look at the tax data that we had obtained to see if it was real. So a combination of that and then the old-fashioned thing of just going to the people and asking them if they were contesting whether this was real, and really I think no one did. The question of deciding what to publish, I mean, that was something that was something a lot of thought and conversation went into, because we wanted to avoid just publishing sort of salacious stories, or stories about just how wealthy people were, because we didn't feel that was in the public interest. So we were looking for stories where there was some sort of either legal or illegal tax avoidance, tax evasion going on that we felt would inform a public conversation, like Jamie was saying, about the tax code and enforcement of the tax laws. So we were focused on things that we thought would potentially shine light on we have this, obviously if you find something illegal, that's going to be a good story, but there's this phrase that we have that gets thrown around of, like, the scandal is what's legal. And there's a lot of stories where you find something that is clearly scandalous and wrong, but it's not illegal. And so there was certainly some of the tax stories that fell into that category.
All right, we have time for one more question.
I wonder if any of you have an experience where you worked on a story and you got sort of the highest professional standards, but you had your career threatened because of it. I mean, you had your life threatened with a gun, but I'm not.
Yeah, I don't know, covering politics and state government, that I ever had my whole career threatened. I think that as I mentioned before, I was written about a couple of times, and that certainly hurt. But I also learned that, it was what was expected, and I didn't have to worry about it. So yeah, thankfully not that level of threat.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think I've had my career threatened, although, you know, that these things can change quickly, so knock on wood. But it is scary, though, right? I mean, not physically scary, but it's scary writing about doing stories on billionaires who have, you know, basically limitless resources. Some of whom, you know, I wrote a story about Peter Thiel in this tax series about how he used his retirement account, Roth IRA, to shield basically much of his fortune from taxes. And he's somebody that, you know, you may remember got really upset at Gawker, the news website, for something they'd written about him, like a gossip item. And like 10 years later, years and years later, it came out that he had financed a totally unrelated invasion of privacy lawsuit against Gawker that ended up putting them out of business. So, you know, when you see something like that, like I think it would be foolish not to be paranoid. Thankfully, we at ProPublica we have libel insurance, we have good lawyers in-house, we have external lawyers, and so, you know, you really can't do this stuff as a freelancer. Like, institutional backing is huge. I'm sure you have good libel insurance also. I hope you do.
Yes, we do,
Yeah.
and a good attorney, as I've mentioned.
Yes.
I would like to bring to the stage now Sandy Timmons, who is our board chair and has been for the past 4 years. Sandy has a background in media, and she recognizes its power, and it's also its ability to have effect and influence. She's an incredible partner. She has a no-nonsense way about her, keeps me grounded, keeps me looking forward, and supports our vision for the future. So, welcome, Sandy. Yes.
Thank you very much, Lori. We didn't rehearse, obviously. I am Sandy Timmons, and I was brought into inewsource by a very good friend of mine, Stephanie Bergsma. We had been partners in crime at KPBS many years ago, where she was development chair, and I was a lowly producer in Gloria Penner's public affairs department. But over the years, we got to understand our commitment to the news and to public broadcasting and nonprofit news. So I want to thank her very much, because it's been a wonderful journey. But even more so, I want to say today is a celebration. And so first we're going to do now, the next thing we're going to do is actually look at our video that was compiled by our wonderful staff. JR, are you around anymore? There you went. And it's wonderful, and I haven't seen it either, so we can all ooh and all together. So roll video.
I didn't see this until it was pretty much finished. I would rather have had it be more about the organization than about me, but it is very heart-wrenching to hear those comments from my staff and former staff. So let me just say that I hope this video underscores for you how far we've come and how much we've accomplished over 15 years. We started in a narrow, windowless office at San Diego State's journalism school, and today we employ 20 people, everyone of whom believes without hesitation that we can make San Diego a better place by telling the truth, building trust, and keeping watch on the people and the institutions that matter. The video is heartening and allows me a few minutes to contemplate the hard work and dedication and success we have experienced. But today we would like you to think about the future and consider our bold and ambitious plan. San Diego needs us. The time is now, and the urgency gets greater every day. As I indicated in my comments earlier, inewsource envisions a community-powered news ecosystem that informs, educates, investigates, and maintains public accountability for the people of San Diego and Imperial counties. We need to continue building the infrastructure with more documenters and more reporters and editors and more partnerships with other media and community organizations. Our budget today is $2.9 million. And our 20 staff members have changed laws and lives through their journalism. We see the potential to double our budget over the next 4 years to ensure that the county is fully represented across the county with the documenters, community reporting, and most importantly, investigative reporting. It's not that expensive, all things considered. We're talking about original reporting, local stories you can't get anywhere else. Think about what you pay to subscribe to the Union Tribune, which has less and less local news in it, you probably noticed. Or how much you pay to subscribe to the New York Times. How much do you spend each month on media subscriptions? Netflix, Amazon, Fubo. Our costs can't be broken down as easily as some service organizations. It costs so much to house X number of homeless vets, or feed so many people, or it costs so much to care for an abandoned animal. News and information isn't neat. In fact, it's really messy. I can tell you it costs about $150,000 a year to employ with benefits and editing support an investigative reporter. It costs $350,000 to run our documenters program in the South Bay and only in parts of San Diego. It costs about $30,000 a year to train and pay college students to attend public meetings, learn how government works, and participate in their democracy. How much is it worth to you, I ask, to help us make San Diego a better place?
I just had to watch that. So like Matthew said earlier, our lawyer in the back, because of its importance to democracy, the press sometimes is called the fourth branch of government, but it's also very much a business. Lori was just giving us some of the numbers of our business. It is one that is dependent on its ability to attract eyeballs and dollars. I believe that our plan, utilizing the documenters in greater number of communities, not just where they are now, to connect with communities for good local news, for more investigative journalism, and shining more lights into the darkness, are possible, led by Lori and our leadership team. We can do this, and we know this, we can do this, and because we have seen this incredible growth of inewsource, we know that we are the ones who can get into the communities and actually do this reporting. We don't just focus on downtown, we don't just focus on government relations, but they give us the clues of what's happening in the communities, and we can report back. Your donations are pivotal to advancing this vision. As we mark our 15 years, we are eager to kickstart that next chapter. Your generosity can make it happen. If there's something specific that you care about, the documenters, early career journalism, investigative journalism, and you would like to support them, contact us, Lori Hearn at inewsource.org, and talk to us about what you have in mind. Inside the reports that are going home, if you want them, there'll be pledge cards and envelopes if you're so moved to commit to a donation right now. But we know that with your support, we can go forward and we can keep on doing what we've been doing so well.
Celebrating our 15th anniversary. You don't have to be in a rush to leave. The bar is still open, there's still more food, and if you'd like to talk to any of us about our programs or our plans for the future, we're here. Thank you.